Well, we told you that John Carpenter was a pretty big deal, and here he is again in 1982 with arguably the greatest remake of all time. After a ton of success going independent with movies like Halloween and Assault on Precinct 13, and then back-to-back with smaller company Avco on Escape from New York and The Fog, a big studio was finally ready to take a chance on him. Universal decided that Carpenter was the right guy to remake The Thing. But it would be more than just a remake of the 50s classic. It would be a reimagining of the short story Who Goes There by John W. Campbell.
You know, my all-time favorite was John Carpenter's The Thing. I didn't work on it, so I can say that. Instead of going into the ones I did.
John Carpenter wasn't the first choice, but 40 years later, it's clear that he was the right one.
I went to the theater, sat there blown away by it. Absolutely blown away. Like, I couldn't take my eyes off of the screen. I probably saw it 8 times in the first week.
One of those films that encapsulates paranoia so beautifully.
John Carpenter's The Thing, to me, is the ultimate horror movie because it's body horror and it's identity horror. It's the questioning of what is the self and who are you really, and can you trust that anybody who represents themselves to you is being truthful?
Released on June 25th, 1982, The Thing seems like it would have been a slam dunk. It made more than its budget, is known as one of the best horror movies ever made, and got things like a prequel, board game, and a video game to its name. While now, over 40 years later, it's considered a masterpiece of tension and paranoia with some of the best practical effects ever put to film. In the summer of 1982, it was absolutely crushed. Critics hated it, and moviegoers were much more enamored with a different extraterrestrial who came to visit Elliot and his family in the summer of '82. And with all due respect to Steven Spielberg and his creations, we are much more in love with the shape-shifting creature that wants to take over your home rather than phone home.
Clearly, the soft fuzzy one won out in the end, but I would argue, if you mention The Thing to anybody to this day, it immediately resonates. You mention E.T., people go, oh yeah, E.T.
On today's episode of 80s Horror Memories, we are looking at the movie that keeps getting better with age, John Carpenter's The Thing.
You gotta be fucking kidding.
The Thing isn't one of those movies I was able to watch uncut for the first time all the way through. It was a film that I caught bits and pieces of on UPN or USA, that's channel 28 for me. And it was a favorite well before I rented it from Video Unlimited around the corner. It was also a movie that was special to everyone in my house. My dad had loved the 1950s version with James Arness as the original, more vegetable-like creature, and thought this version did the story better. My brothers were either in love with it or petrified of it, with one of them always heading down the hall as he could only listen to the part where Norris has a heart attack. As I saw it on TV first, I also had no idea I was watching a TV cut with new scenes and a narrator thrown in.
McCready, a top helicopter pilot, worked for Hughes Aircraft as a test pilot until he got into a confrontation with top management and resigned to take this assignment.
TV cuts were something that would happen often with Carpenter movies. The original Dawn of the Dead and The Thing were two of the videos that always called out to me at the store. Dawn with its zombie head coming up over the sunrise, and today's flick with its mysterious person standing in the snow, but also seems to lunge towards you. Even though I had already seen most of the movie on basic cable, being able to see this uncut masterpiece was a revelation. I remember knowing mostly what was coming and still jumping out of my seat when my dad timed his scare perfectly with a certain blood test scene. I've seen this movie more times than I can remember, and it is just as good every single time I watch it. Carpenter was a fantastic choice for director for multiple reasons. Carpenter had a history with Howard Hawks. He was his favorite director, and his own Assault on Precinct 13 was a take on the great Rio Bravo starring John Wayne. What a lot of people don't remember is that The Thing from Another World wasn't actually directed by Howard Hawks, but it is seen as a Howard Hawks movie. Think of poor Henry Selick as the director of The Nightmare Before Christmas. Sure, he directed it, but it is seen as Tim Burton's movie. Carpenter was also excited to go back to the roots of the original story, as The Thing from Another World deviated from the source material. And that's putting it nicely. The screenplay was written by Bill Lancaster, though the script that he made compared to what was filmed ended up being pretty different.
I believe horror is an allegorical medium, and it allows us to talk about things in society, things about ourselves, things about humanity. And The Thing does that really well. The Bill Lancaster script is premium stuff.
Lancaster would only have one other big title to his name, and that's the 1976 classic Bad News Bears, about a misfit group of little leaguers led by a surly manager in Walter Matthau. He passed away at 50, but his legacy from this movie alone will live on as the flick gets passed on to newer generations. While many of the behind-the-camera crew was different than the normal Carpenter bunch like Lancaster, the cinematography was shot by his longtime collaborator and Oscar nominee, Dean Cundey. From the opening shot of the dog being chased to the final scene of the survivors deciding what to do, the movie has some of the best shots in all of horror. While Cundey was helping behind the lens, Alan Howarth, the regular number 2 in the music department, was nowhere to be found. Instead, Carpenter enlisted the help of Italian cinema giant Ennio Morricone. His score here adds so much to the tension, dread, and isolation of the movie that it truly becomes its own character. While it was completely done by Morricone, it also slides nicely in with the music that Carpenter would be known for throughout his career. The cast is filled with character actors and former stars. Kurt Russell, who ends up being the reluctant lead of the movie, was actually the last man to be cast. He was involved in the casting decisions to help his close friend and director out, but had no intention of appearing in the film. Pilot R.J. McCready was originally supposed to be played by a range of actors, including Tom Atkins, Sam Shepard, Nick Nolte, Jeff Bridges, and even Christopher Walken. Much of the rest of the cast was a floating rotation of choices too. Ernie Hudson, Carl Weathers, Bernie Casey, and the Duke of New York himself, Isaac Hayes, were almost picked for Childs before Keith David was eventually selected. This collaboration led to David being the only choice to play his role later in the decade in They Live. Donald Pleasance was almost selected for Blair, and I can't help but think of an alternate universe where Pleasance is Blair. Much like with Kurt Russell, these other actors may have been fine choices for their roles, but it's hard to imagine anyone else playing these doomed men.
The cast was impeccable.
With the 12 men of U.S. Outpost Number 31 cast and ready to go, filming took place in late August of '81 and ended 12 weeks later. Most of it was shot in Juneau, Alaska, Stewart, British Columbia, and sets on the Universal lot. The original budget was supposed to be set at $10 million, with an additional $200,000 for creature effects. After storyboarding and the creation process began, 21-year-old Rob Bottin felt that he would need up to $750K for his effects. First off, what were you doing at 21? And second, Talk about a sound investment.
You talk about the Norris transformation where the head stretches off the table, breaks away, the tongue comes out, the legs, spider legs grow out of the head. It's like you use every trick in the book. Every trick in the book. Reverse photography, if you look at the desk where the head comes off, there's a track in the desk where they were puppeteering through the track in the desk. The floor was elevated. When the tongue comes out, it was shot in reverse and the tongue was pulled back. When they push the legs out, and then when you see the spider head running away, it's a radio-controlled car. When the spider head's underneath the desk looking, it's a hand puppet. So they used every trick in the book to create this character, to create this alien creature that at the time when you watched it, you believed every second of it.
If there is one thing that the movie will always be remembered for, and even pointed to in the great debate between practical versus digital effects, it's the amazing design of the alien that wants to mimic us to take over. Fallon worked so hard and tirelessly that he would end up in the hospital for exhaustion, double pneumonia, and an ulcer. While he is known more for this movie, we already discussed Rob and his work on the far less exhausting production of The Fog, including him having fun playing the vengeful Captain Blake.
And then, of course, you have Cinefantastique, which had Rob Bottin on the cover with the Thing head in the background. It was the first time that there were behind-the-scenes photos of them creating all of the puppets. And there was the storyboards by Mike Plug and actually telling you how they did it. And to me, that was like one of the gold mines. And every makeup effects artist has that issue in their hand, because that was the one that gave you the behind the curtain look at how the effects were created.
The story follows Outpost number 31 in Antarctica being turned upside down when they find out that a Norwegian camp had unleashed an alien creature thousands of years after it crashed on Earth. Its goal is to assimilate the planet, but it happened to land in the least populous place on Earth. While they thought they merely saved a dog, the men unwittingly let the creature into their ranks, where it slowly takes over some of them, while creating paranoia and distrust within their ranks. They die, or are assimilated one by one, while some of them get wise to what's happening. One of them kills the remaining dogs, destroys the radio, and disables the equipment to keep them there, while one other figures out a test on how to prove who is human and who is an imitation. It finishes with an explosive ending and a few key questions.
The effects are amazing. All that stuff are, the setting's amazing, the isolation, but it's the paranoia. It's that primal fear of the other and the fear that these people who I think I know could turn against me.
So the movie made very little money and was hated by critics upon release. With the talent behind and in front of the camera, however, it was destined to become an all-time classic. How did all of these parts come together to create such a lightning-in-a-bottle experience? The moment-to-moment scenes in this movie can all be broken down into great ones, but there are a handful that really pop. These characters are all pretty familiar with each other, but also stressed with what happens. Their existence and work is disturbed by seemingly crazy Norwegians trying to kill a dog. The Norwegians are killed, one of their own, Bennings, is shot, and the mystery is just beginning. They get more and more stressed and more paranoid of who is a thing and who is a human. They witness horrifying events like a dog creature trying to assimilate the rest of the pack, one of their own members starting to change before being burned, and then another dying of a heart attack before splitting into multiple parts, all hell-bent on surviving and taking them over.
For me, I can still watch it, still get tense, because again, it's not about the kills and the amount of blood, it's about the suspense and about the truth inside the story.
The fear and distrust that these men feel is palpable in every scene. But there is one specific scene that transcends the rest. I've watched this movie with multiple people at different times in my life, and every time the blood test comes up, I find myself watching them more than the movie. See, the surviving men, led by Kurt Russell's MacReady, have figured out that even one cell of blood from one of the imitations can be alive and will defend itself. They are testing dead bodies, one killed by MacReady himself, and another that was killed by the chaos of the previous scene. MacReady knows in his heart that the test will work and even performs it on himself. As he goes down the line of both deceased and living subjects, you start to wonder if it will actually work. An argument breaks out that only raises the tension before the dish of blood explodes, and someone you may not have expected starts to change. Every time I've watched this scene with someone, they jump nearly out of their chair when the blood reacts. The men start screaming and chaos ensues yet again, with little break from the previous scene.
A scene with Palmer, sitting on the end of the couch when they realize he's the one that's infected after the test, and he just sort of starts to shake, and he's been the most goofy. He's been the most, the one who's been the most disarming, and it's like, that fucking thing is him.
While that scene is undoubtedly the most remembered and inspiring, Robert Rodriguez took it for his testing scene in The Faculty. The movie is stitched together with incredible moments that all seem to piggyback onto each other until the climax, when it comes down to the final four men, and they decide that the world being spared of the aliens' takeover is more important than their own lives. The whole station has to go. Blair, who has become the main vessel for the shapeshifter, kills at least one of the remaining men before MacReady is able to blow it up, seemingly ending the threat. He ends up with Childs, who looks to be the last survivor, but neither man trusts the other as they wait for their deaths. Carpenter wanted to keep the ending bleak and in the dark, but has had different opinions depending on what interview you see. Sometimes he's stated that both men are human, but other interviews he states that Childs is clearly not breathing while Max still is. While the movie has cemented its popularity, its legacy is more murky. It would have been board games, a video game that had a cameo from the director himself and was considered canon, comic books that were also considered canon, and a prequel that came out in 2011. Sadly, the prequel would forego its practical effects that were already made, mind you, in favor of that not so great looking CGI. While the original movie is available in many formats with all the special features you could ask for, most of the other media is pretty expensive, hard to find, or both. Even though it's a masterpiece now, it was seen as a massive failure when it premiered. And to any of those critics that feel that way, we say to you,
fuck you too!
On the next episode, we're going to look back at the movies that try to impress us by sticking things in our faces. So put on your 3D glasses for absolutely no reason, because just like those VHS rentals, this video is not in 3D. Until next time, Gorehounds.
Hi friends, your humble narrator Tyler Nichols here, and I hope that you enjoyed that episode of 80s Horror Memories. If you missed our previous episode, click over here. If you want to see more from our series, click up here. And if you're not subscribed yet, what are you doing? Subscribe right here. And most importantly, stay spooky, folks.